Megatron wasn't born a monster. Long before he became the leader of the Decepticons and before the war consumed Cybertron, Megatron believed he could change his world. He was a fighter, a revolutionary, and in some versions of the Transformers story, a voice for Cybertronians who had been forgotten by the system. But somewhere along the way, Megatron's fight for freedom became a fight for control, and that transformation would eventually turn him into Optimus Prime's greatest enemy. This is the story of Megatron. Part 1. Before the War. Before the Autobots and Decepticons became enemies, Cybertron was already divided. Cybertronian society was structured around different roles and social classes, and not every Transformer had the same opportunities. Megatron rose from one of the lower levels of society. In several major versions of the Transformers mythos, he became known as a gladiator. That detail is important. The gladiator arena wasn't simply where Megatron learned how to fight. It was where he learned how power worked. Megatron saw a society that he believed was fundamentally broken. The ruling system had created order, but Megatron believed that order had come at the expense of freedom. And his anger began attracting followers. At first, his movement wasn't necessarily about destroying Cybertron. It was about changing it. But there was a problem. Megatron's solution to oppression gradually became another form of domination. Part 2. The Rise of the Decepticons. As Megatron's influence grew, so did the movement that would eventually become the Decepticons. The Decepticons weren't simply an army of villains. They represented a rebellion against Cybertron's existing order. But Megatron increasingly believed that the only way to create a better Cybertron was to take control of it himself. That difference would become everything. A revolution can begin with the idea of freedom. But once the leader believes only they are capable of creating that freedom, the revolution can become something else entirely. And that's essentially what happened to Megatron. His followers became soldiers. His movement became an army. And Cybertron descended into war. Part 3. Optimus Prime. And then there was Optimus. The relationship between Optimus Prime and Megatron is one of the most important relationships in Transformers history. They aren't simply hero and villain. They represent two completely different answers to the same problem. Megatron believes Cybertron needs to be changed through force. Optimus believes Cybertron needs to be protected through leadership and responsibility. In some continuities, the two were once allies or at least respected one another, but their philosophies eventually became impossible to reconcile. The war had begun, and Megatron needed an enemy powerful enough to challenge him. He found one in Optimus Prime. Part 4. The War for Cybertron. The conflict between Autobots and Decepticons devastated Cybertron. What began as a political and social struggle became a war for survival. Megatron's forces grew stronger, but Cybertron itself was being destroyed. Resources disappeared, cities fell, and eventually the war spread beyond Cybertron. This is one of the great ironies of Megatron's story. He wanted to change Cybertron, but his pursuit of victory helped destroy the very world he wanted to control. The longer the war continued, the less Megatron's original ideals mattered. There was only victory and defeat. Part 5. Earth. Eventually, the conflict between Optimus Prime and Megatron reached Earth. The details differ depending on the Transformers continuity. In some versions, the Autobots and Decepticons arrive on Earth after the Ark and Nemesis crash onto the planet. In others, the story is completely different. But the basic conflict remains. Megatron wants power, Optimus wants to stop him, and Earth becomes another battlefield in a war that began millions of years earlier. Megatron's plans on Earth vary across different continuities. Sometimes he wants Energon. Sometimes he wants Cybertronian technology. Sometimes he wants to conquer Earth itself. And sometimes Earth is simply another step toward reclaiming Cybertron. But there is one constant. Optimus Prime is always standing in his way. Part 6. Why Megatron can never accept defeat. This is where Megatron becomes particularly interesting. Megatron doesn't simply hate Optimus because Optimus defeats him. He hates what Optimus represents. Optimus represents the possibility that Cybertron can be protected without becoming a dictatorship. Every time Optimus defeats Megatron, he's not just stopping an attack. He's challenging Megatron's entire philosophy. And that's why their conflict keeps returning. Megatron can't simply defeat Optimus. He needs to prove that his worldview was right. Part 7. Megatron's greatest weakness. Megatron is often portrayed as one of the most intelligent and powerful Cybertronians. But his greatest strength is also his greatest weakness. He refuses to compromise. Once Megatron believes he is right, changing his mind becomes almost impossible. And that creates a cycle. He loses, he becomes more determined. He gains power, he loses again. And instead of questioning his philosophy, he searches for even greater power. That's why Megatron can never truly escape the war. The war isn't just something he fights. It's part of who he has become. Part 8. The Many Megatrons. One of the most interesting things about Transformers is that there isn't just one definitive Megatron, the original Generation 1. Megatron established many of the characteristics that would define the character. Transformers. Animated gave him another interpretation. Transformers. Prime presented a particularly complex version of his history. The live-action films gave audiences a physically imposing Megatron who became one of the franchise's most recognizable villains. And other continuities have continued to reinvent him. But beneath all those versions is the same basic idea. Megatron begins with a belief that Cybertron is broken, and he becomes increasingly convinced that only he can fix it. Part 9. Villain or revolutionary? So was Megatron always evil? Not necessarily. That's what makes him interesting. The strongest versions of Megatron aren't interesting because he simply wants to destroy everything. They're interesting because you can understand where the anger came from. He saw injustice. He wanted change. He attracted people who believed in that change. But somewhere along the way, Megatron stopped fighting against oppression and started believing that his own power was the solution. The revolutionary became the ruler. The fighter became the dictator. And the man who wanted to free Cybertron became one of the greatest threats it had ever faced. Ending. Megatron's story is ultimately a tragedy. He had the intelligence to change Cybertron. He had the strength to lead an army. And he had millions of years to prove that his way could work. But he couldn't let go of the need to control the outcome, and that's why Optimus Prime remains his greatest enemy. Not because Optimus is stronger, not because Optimus is smarter, but because Optimus represents something Megatron eventually lost, the belief that power should be used to protect others rather than control them. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of Megatron. He started the war believing Cybertron needed to be freed. He ended it believing Cybertron needed to obey. And somewhere between those two ideas, Megatron lost himself. If you want more Transformers stories, lore, and character breakdowns, subscribe to Cybertron Archives.